In this video, we're going to look at the Cambridge Advanced C1 speaking test. So let's just talk a little bit about how the exam is organised. The first thing to say is that the test is 15 minutes long. There are 4 parts to the test. In part 1, the examiner asks some general questions to both candidates. In part 2, the individual exercise, candidates need to compare pictures. Part 3 is a collaboration exercise on a particular topic. And then finally, part 4 is a discussion, which is an extension of the same theme that candidates found in part 3. So let's take a look at these different parts and how they're organized. Part 1 is a collection of general questions, and there are questions the examiner asks both people. Typically, the examiner will ask the person's name, where they come from, and then a question like this about how long they've studied English. This is an example of another question that they could ask the candidates. And you can see here these 3 questions usually come at the very beginning of the speaking test. So let's just consider how to answer the questions here. We're going to use the final question that we've just looked at, and just to consider how we can answer this question well. The first thing to say is that candidates should really try to give detailed answers where they can. Obviously, you can't give a detailed answer about your name or perhaps where you come from. But it is important with any other questions like this particular one here that you do try to give a detailed answer. And this is an example of what a candidate could say. So this is somebody who comes from a warmer place, and they've obviously talked about the part of the year they like, which is the summer. They explain a little bit of detail of why they enjoy it, and then there's a comment here about the temperature of 12 degrees, perhaps where they are is not very warm. Let's move on now to the part 2 exercise. Part 2 is the pictures, and what you find is an example like this where you have 3 pictures and 2 questions at the top. Each person has 1 minute to talk about their pictures, and they need to compare the pictures and answer the 2 questions. And then there is a second question where examiners expect candidates to talk for maybe another extra 30 seconds. So what can we do with this particular task? So this is the task we're looking at. So we have the 3 pictures and the 2 questions. So the first thing to say is that you should only do 2 pictures. This is part of the instructions, but sometimes people forget and they start to talk about all 3 pictures. These are not the instructions. The exercise asks you to compare 2 pictures. So the easiest way to do that is to choose your 2 pictures. You can name them if you wish. Sometimes people do that. They'll say picture 1 and picture 2. It helps. It's not part of the exam, but sometimes it helps people. But then if you start by comparing your 2 pictures by using the first question of the 2, and then before you finish up at the minute, try to answer the second question. You may not completely finish it. Let's move on now to part 3. Part 3 is the collaboration, where you have a question and a number of topics related to this question. This part of the test is split into 2 parts. So for this first discussion exercise, candidates have 2 minutes to talk about the first part. And then the examiner stops the candidates and gives them 1 minute for the extra question. And this is an example of the kind of question they might ask them about. They need to consider which of these things have the most influence on people. So what can candidates do with this part 3 exercise? The easiest way to do this particular exercise is to talk about each item in turn, rather than 2 or 3. Occasionally candidates try to talk about 2 or 3 and it just makes the conversation quite difficult. So it's much easier to choose one, discuss one, and go to the next one. It's also important to remember to share the time with your partner. So that means in this particular exercise, you don't have all the time to say what you want. perhaps your answers will be shorter. And what you should also try to do is to invite your partner to participate. Try to connect your ideas. So when your partner is offering ideas, perhaps you can link your own opinions to those. And then finally, most important in a conversation is try to listen. And this will always help to make the task a little bit easier. Let's move on now to part 4. Part 4, as we said, is the same theme as part 3, but for this example here, we've chosen something completely different. And again, it's just to talk about the part 4 task. So what happens in this case is candidates need to give much longer, more detailed answers. This is an opportunity for them perhaps to improve their scores and to get much, much better scores. They need to use the right kind of grammar for the task. And they also need to use appropriate vocabulary, like for example, the first question there is about keeping fit. So a candidate should have a good range of vocabulary to talk about that topic. This part of the exam is controlled by the examiner, so it's not a free discussion, and the examiner will ask candidates individually to answer questions in this part. And that's the speaking test.